Hello, welcome back to another episode of Stories from WineCountry.com. I'm Pete Swanson, curious filmmaker from Leicester, Massachusetts.
And I'm Jim Nicas from the Castle Restaurant in Leicester, Massachusetts.
So what do we got today, Jim?
Peter, we have a story about personalities. Wine is all about people, relationships, besides the beverage, and the personalities behind that. Today is kind of an interesting and funny story about two really of the most gracious and professional people in the wine industry that I've met in my life. And they owned a wholesale company in Everett, Massachusetts, and their family still does, called Ruby Wines, and it's Ted and Bob Rubin. And again, it's all about personalities and in the wine industry, besides the beverage. The story really kind of focuses on port wine. And this goes back into the late 70s, early 80s, when you could probably still get away with this in most respects, but probably not so much today. In 30 years past, you could go to a wholesaler and taste a few things and decide what you wanted to buy rather than them coming to you. You could also go to the warehouse and maybe rummage through their stacks and find things that everyone in business knows that kind of rotating inventory is the way to go. Well, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes things get forgotten in the stacks, and for a company to let a couple 30-year-olds climb into huge rafters of wine in a massive warehouse. To kind of set the scene, it's in was in an industrial park in Everett, and my wife particularly liked it because there was one famous shoemaker who had a kind of retail outlet across the street, although she showed great restraint, and I do respect that, thankfully. To allow you to come in and go into their warehouse and unabatedly just climb into the rafters and crawl or walk through huge stacks of wines 20 and 30 feet in the air and find things that were true gems that were lost, that had been off. And this is one of them, but in particular one that is gone today. It was a port from Geddes, which is Guedes, very small producer, but they had cases of 1940, 1942, 1963, 1944, and I was just thrilled to find some of these. Not a lot of cases, but as you drag them forward, no one knew that they were still there. No one knew how to price them. So they kind of priced them at today's level, which is at that time. It was like a true find. It was, California gold discovery, diamond mines in Africa. It was a gem. So yes, we bought quite a bit of old port at quite a reasonable price, and the Rubins were happy. They sold things that they didn't know they had, and probably would have had difficulty selling it. I'm not sure if the newer generations of Rubins know these stories, but they will now. Just a true gentleman in the industry. We would buy. I think there was 1937, 1940, 1942, 1944, and 63. 63 was the last one used, which was tremendous. It was one of the best vintages that port wine has had, and port is a very expensive wine to make. It's laborious, it's time-consuming, and it takes quite a bit of kind of intestinal fortitude to get this this wine just perfect and aged at different levels and different grades of port, whether it's a vintage or a tawny or late bottle vintage, or simply just a straight ruby. So it is not easy, and it is expensive, but to have something aged coming out of the blocks that was 20 or 30 years old that you could merchandise was a true gem for me, being in the front of the house and able to sell things like that at a reasonable price, and still make money. But
you mentioned that these people were wonderful personalities. What was it about their style, their personalities that made them kind of shine?
Well, we'll go to an adjunct story to this. Again, a 30-year-old, kind of wine, kind of novice but intermediate, just kind of getting into it. Had been buying wine for approximately 9 to 10 years. At that point, and thought that I was right there, and would go to a lot of tastings, and we happened to be, my wife, my 2 daughters, and myself, and my daughters at that point were probably 12 and 3, 13 and 4, somewhere in that area, and we went to a tasting at the Bostonian Hotel, and I remember it so distinctly because my wife, as gracious as she's always been, was going to stay in the lobby and entertain the 2 children while I went upstairs, tasted some wines, and then we would go have a little something to eat, and off we go home. Well, both the Rubens were walking through the lobby. They saw me and my wife, and we had known each other. We had been doing business for a while, and they asked if we were coming upstairs, and I said I was. My wife was staying downstairs with the children, and that was absolutely unacceptable. It was, I have a private suite, your kids are going upstairs, they'll take my suite over, we'll bring in movies and food, and they took my kids as 2 princesses and relocated them in a hotel suite. Made sure that there was things for them to do, things for them to watch, food for them to eat while we were at the tasting. So, it's that kind of depth and personality that no one really understands today. And I'm 46 or 36 years later. It's kind of ingrained, in my mind, and the Rubens are still, Ted's passed away, unfortunately, but the Rubin family still maintains the business, and they will have my undying loyalty for ever and ever.
Great. So talk a little bit more about port. For the novice, what's the definition of a port and the grapes?
Well, port is, there's several grapes that are involved in that. Tinta Rosés, Touriga Nacional, the 2 kind of most prominent. There's different levels of port. And it's a fortified wine, so they're taking the grapes at a ripened stage. They're making the wine and then fortifying it with distilled spirits. In the old days with brandy. And the English are huge in the port trade, because that was kind of their drink of choice too, and they pretty much developed it. But there's several levels. This is a tawny, and this is one of the ones that came out of that kind of curious finding. It's a 67. So 1967, we're talking 33, 49-year-old tawny, and you can see the vibrancy in color, but you see the tawny color because it's wood aged. Now, this was barrel aged till 1978. So it spent 11 years in wood. So a lot of the color is extracted out. A lot of the flavors of the wood, that kind of oak, when you're dealing with a fortified spirit, sometimes we'll pick up that walnutty flavor, raisiny quality, and that's exactly what you have here. You can get a vintage port, which has to be bottled within a couple years of that vintage, and it's usually bottled in a year. It's darker, deeper, richer, more extracted flavors, more grape-like, but the color differential is 10, 15 times this. Again, the straight ruby is something that's being bottled right away. It's kind of entry level. You can get a tawny, and you can get a late bottled vintage. Late bottled vintage will go a few more years in oak. The tawny would get again a little more, but it wouldn't be quite as refined as a vintage tawny.
Now, is port something that you drink just by itself, or do you couple it with food? Or?
It's a beverage that works tremendously with food, with dried fruits, with relatively strong cheeses. We had some tremendous experiences in Portugal, going up north to Oporto and tasting with certain families. And in fact, if I can get the timeline straight, because it's 66, my memory sometimes lapses a bit, but we had a tremendous experience at the Morobasto Castle with that family, and tasting ports in the winter in a somewhat cold and drafty castle in northern Portugal in the winter, and I guess it was January. And God, it had to be January 71 or 72. But like I said, I'll get that squared. You really enjoy the depth and flavor, the alcohol, the warmth, because this, as they say, will warm you right to the tips of your toes.
Well, it's interesting because my experience with port is my family's Swedish heritage, and we would make a Christmas drink called glögg, which is port mixed up with spices and alcohol, and you serve it hot, and that would certainly warm you up on a winter day.
Yes, well, you're not going to serve this hot, but it really is a brilliant beverage that really doesn't get the use and respect across the board that it should. Most people think of port as something that people that abuse sometimes will drink, and unfortunately they characterize white port as almost a pariah. But in the summertime, white port on the rocks, slice of orange, if you want a little soda water, but just a glass of white port on the rocks with a slice of orange, nothing can really compare to how light, elegant, and how much fun that is to drink.
Wow, great. Well, this is a great story. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
See you next time.